Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our study of Acts of the Apostles, which we have been doing since May of last year. So it's been a long read, over 18 months so forth. This has been a long, in-depth study of this critical book of the New Testament. We move into chapter 24 today. Paul was arrested in Jerusalem during his purification ritual after being rescued there by the Roman army from this Jewish mob that was going to stone him. Because he was a Roman citizen, the military commander had him taken to the Roman governor in Caesarea, which is where the military regional office was, for trial and judgment. We take up that trial in today's lesson, which is chapter 24, starting in verse 1 and going to the end of the chapter, reading in the New Revised Standard Version. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and an attorney, a certain Tertullus, and they reported their case against Paul to the governor. When Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Your Excellency, because of you we have long enjoyed peace, and reforms have been made for this people because of your foresight. We welcome this in every way and everywhere in utmost gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you to hear us briefly with your customary graciousness. We have in fact found this man a pestilent fellow, an agitator among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of a sect of Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and so we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn from him concerning everything of which we accused him." The Jews also joined in a charge by asserting that all of this was true. When the governor motioned to him to speak, Paul replied, "I cheerfully make my defense, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation. As you can find out, it is no more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They did not find me disputing with anyone in the temple, or stirring up a crowd either in the synagogue or throughout the city. Neither can they prove to you the charge that they now bring against me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call the sect, I worship the God of our ancestry, believing everything laid down according to the law or written in the prophets. I have a hope. I have a hope in God. I have a hope that they themselves also accept that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Therefore I do my best always to have a clear conscience towards God and all people. Now, after some years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to offer sacrifices. While I was doing this, they found me in the temple, completing the rites of purification, without any crowd or disturbance. But there were some Jews from Asia. They ought to be there before you to make an accusation if they have anything against me. Or let these men here tell what crimes they have found when I stood before the council. Unless it was this one sentence that I called out while standing before them, it is about the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today." But Felix, who was rather well informed about the way, adjourned the hearing with the comment, "When Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case." When he ordered the centurion, then he ordered the centurion to keep him in custody, but let him have some liberty, and not to prevent him or his friends from taking care of his needs. Some days later, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him speak concerning the faith in Jesus Christ. And as he discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present. When I have an opportunity, I will send for you." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, and for that reason, he used to send for him very often and converse with him. After 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and since he wanted to grant the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. The narrative here is pretty straightforward, as scholars say. Well, it's easy to understand what's there, but there's more to the story, some contextual things we should be aware of. Scholars generally set the stage here by noting this is the second phase of the legal process against Paul before a Roman official that would have been authorized to judge him, which is actually the procurator Felix in Caesarea, the provincial capital of the Roman Palestine, which included Judea. Sometimes you'll see him referred, and often here referred to as governor. Dr. Robert Wall, in his commentary, teaches this is the only time in Acts that Paul is actually prosecuted. In other words, that is presented here as a prosecution. What is said here fits a standard Roman judicial procedure of that period, notes forensic historians of ancient Roman trials. The prosecuting attorney here, Tertullus, presents the charges. Paul defends himself, and the case is remanded to the judge, who can either render a verdict or postpone it to a higher Roman judge, which would have basically been the emperor. That's the next stage. Dr. Wall notes that in this case, that is the process that separates Paul and the Christian community, called the Way here, movement, from Judaism, as far as prosecution is concerned. Others note that Roman law at the time, however, had not been codified or applied on an entire empire basis. So what Luke is describing here gets questioned by a number of legal historians as to whether it actually happened at this time and place this way. Instead, they tend to speculate, there's a number of them, suggest that what more likely has happened here is Luke has some information of what happened, and then he places it at the time he's writing, which is some years later, in the scheme that was set up once Rome destroyed the temple system and so forth, and then established its own authority fully in the area to apply also to Jews. Dr. Matthew Skinner, in his very recent commentary, notes that we often see Felix referred to as governor, but his title was procurator, which was considered an extension of the emperor's own authority, and that he has great discretion in his power. It's not just legal, he has military and judgmental powers that don't necessarily have to follow the law. He is not just determining whether Paul's actions violated some legal statute here, but also as to whether this situation that he now finds himself in is destabilizing in any form or fashion to this Roman province of Palestine. Several note here that Paul's statute as a Roman citizen gives him much more statute. When you think about Jesus' situation, 30 years before, or in this case, about 20 years before Pontius Pilate. Jesus and Paul's situation, when they're compared, thinking about that a little bit, Paul has much more protection than Jesus would have had, because he's a Roman citizen. Jesus was not. Note that Paul is under the imperial judge here for over 2 years. In other words, he's being retained by him for over 2 years based on this account. So why there's no immediate judgment is not clear. There's not, for some reason, sort of implied he's trying to get money out of him, but there's no other reason really given. It's as if several scholars say it's as if Luke didn't have that information when he wrote, and so he throws a little something in there to let it wiggle. Some scholars suggest it may have been that the governor has more influence over the Jews by keeping Paul alive and using him as a bait, if you will, than he would be if he went ahead and had him killed suddenly, which he clearly could have had him done. Dr. William Willimon, in his commentary, notes that he must realize all of this time that Paul is in mortal danger. That means we must realize that Paul must follow his call through many tribulations. This point is made here that he must also appear and be a witness for the way in Rome. He says at this point in the Christian movement not to forget that Rome is not a friend of the Christian movement. It will become a major friend 300 years later, but not at this point. Implied within the story is that God has chosen Paul as his instrument, and God is in overall control. Even though Rome rules the land, Rome rules a lot of life, the ultimate control is with God. He teaches that here in Acts. We see Luke as a master adventure narrator. He said this is extremely well written. Scholars suggest Luke took a generally dim view of imperial Rome, but is writing this in such a manner that it is not obvious that that's the situation. Romans can be useful in the protection of the Christian faith against Jewish extremism. It's kind of an underlying current that Luke seems to be writing in here, some scholars say. But the high priest Ananias, through his attorney Tertullus, serves as a prosecutor and presents his charges, not on the grounds of a faith or theological debate, but as a political enemy of the system, the political enemy to Rome, if you will. And that doesn't seem to carry much weight here. He presents him as a leader of a sect of Nazarenes, implying that this sect is a destabilizing agent, more or less. Zero evidence has been presented to reflect such is to be true, however. Moreover, the Jews tried to kill Paul defending theological positions back there when they were trying to do it. In other words, he was defiling the temple, which is where God placed his name. That sort of idea, where God's going to be. His presence will be at certain times. So they charged, but now here in front of the emperor, they've totally switched. It's a problem. It's more of a legal problem, a political problem, if you will. Jewish scholars note that Jews could not legally execute another Jew on a political charge. So they've switched what they're actually really primarily charging him with. As to the term sect of Nazarene used here, scholars do not agree as to how that should be properly interpreted, except to say it seems to be used in a very negative manner here. The implied meaning is they're not good guys. One scholar suggests maybe it's sort of like indicating, well, several people say they think it's just referring to the followers of Jesus and Jesus being of Nazareth, but most scholars don't buy that. Others teach it is used more in a degrading sort of manner here, in that Paul is sort of some kind of a redneck, rebellious leader of a zealot, bunch of hill people from this Nazareth, Judea area. The Judaism of Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots, and then this low-class group, kind of the Nazarenes. And another scholar used the word, it's presented in a way as if it could be interpreted as a despised people. The main theme of Paul's defense is his proof he is innocent of these charges, using the following points. I come to the holy city to worship, not to cause trouble. The public reading will show why he was in the temple, the public record. They cannot prove I disputed with anyone or tried to stir up trouble in that temple or in a synagogue or even in the city of Jerusalem. He admits to being of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, Dr. Timothy Johnson of Emory University says that in itself is a key change in Paul's position, because he tends to have been avoiding that. He even goes so far as to say it's almost like he's repeating what Peter did, denying his association with Jesus 3 times. It's not quite that, but he said there's that underlying current. So, for the most part, Dr. Johnson and Emory suggest up to this point in time, Paul has tended to, in this debate that's going on now, this legal debate, to have been more in denial, or at least not fully admitting. He has at least said he's affiliated with the Way, but not necessarily the sect, which somehow or another implies it has a negative taste on the mind of a Roman. But he adds to his offense, I worship, though, this is Paul's key point, regardless of what sect I'm with, I worship the ancestral God of Israel, the God of the Old Testament, so to speak. I worship the ancestral God of Israel. That's his point. Meaning, I am completely loyal to the God of Scripture, the God of that Old Testament, to the prophets. Admitting he is a Pharisee means he believes in the hope of the resurrection of the dead, which was in direct opposition to the Sadducees, who did not believe that, and of which the high priest would have been a member of. They reject that teaching. Scholars suggest Luke wants the reader to assume that Felix here is well informed and knowledgeable of the way, of what's going on in Christianity, and of Judaism in general. So he was qualified to judge if Paul's actions were following Orthodox Jewish rules. Paul claims he was in the temple following what the Jewish law required, that is, since he had been gone and in contact with Gentiles, he had to go through purification rituals before he could enter the temple proper, and he was sequestered away, where he needed to be away from other Jews until that purification was over. Felix's wife Drusilla, that's mentioned here, She was Jewish. She was the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa I, that is the main Herod, and the sister of King Agrippa II, who ruled in a neighboring area. Maybe Felix wants her Jewish nuts to somehow or another maybe have an impact on Paul. Maybe she would have better insight in some ways to things that might be going on. There's people speculate all kinds as to why she's suddenly mentioned here, because otherwise it doesn't seem that she's really carrying on any role. But for some reason, as scholars say, there is a significance to Luke putting Drusilla here. It may have been something that was important to the Romans, but has no real effect for the rest of it. Scholars just sort of say, we don't know what to do with why Drusilla is mentioned here. Hope that gives you some idea of how scholars are looking at some added points of context in this reading, and we'll see you in a later lesson.